So last week or last time we met for Bible study, we discussed marriage. And remember, I just want to remind you guys that the Corinthians had a wrong view of marriage and sex. They thought, again, sex was something that was evil. It was bodily and fleshly desires, which made it evil. So they were abstaining sex from one another, even as a married couple. Now, I forgot to mention last time, this is probably also a reason why some of the people of Corinthians were going to prostitutes to relieve their sexual frustrations, I guess, because their spouses were not giving them the rights to have sex with them. So again, Paul had to correct his view. Marriage is not a sin. Sex is not a sin. Marriage, you should not separate. So he goes on to explain their desire for singleness was wrong. Their desire, remember, the Corinthians thought that because sex is evil and this marriage is evil in their eyes, that they have to separate in order to be holy, to be spiritually better. And Paul had to correct this view on singleness, saying, no, that is not the right view. And again, he had to cover what grounds for divorce and what he thought was not the grounds for divorce. Again, he taught from Jesus's teachings on marriage and divorce, but he expounded upon it with his own thoughts that God has given him insight to in regards to marriage, singleness, and divorce. And then at the end of that section, in the middle of chapter 27, we went over a section of lives we are called to do. And the question was, are you content even in your current situation? Whether you're single or married, whether you're a slave or not, are you content in living your lives out for God, even in your current situation? Can you say there is still a contentment, joy, purpose, even if you are free or not, married or not, to worship God? So that was just covering a quick recap of what happened in last time's Bible study. Today, we're going to be covering a topic that Paul loves, in a sense, because it relates to him, and it is singleness. He's going to go a little bit, expound upon it a little bit more in depth. And now I know all of us here are married, and it's like, man, I don't need to listen to this Bible study because I'm married. But it's not just for the singles to hear. There's actually a lot of stuff that we get out of it, even as married couples, that Paul calls us to how to live. So we're going to dive into that. So if you have your Bibles from me to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and sorry, that is a typo. We'll be starting in verse 25. Now, concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think in the view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. If you are betrothed, and if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. So again, he is covering this next topic of singleness and the wrong views. Again, he's addressing the wrong views of the church regarding singleness and marriage, and he's going to throw in his own advice, not just a humanly advice, but a very wise advice that God has given him insight in regards to singleness, married life, and just living in general. So the question is, who is the betrothed? And in other translations, they will say virgins. So he switches from emphasizing marriage, and now he's going to singleness. And again, he's emphasizing that this is not a command from God, but advice that he gives, which one is to consider regarding their theological stance, the eschatology, what's going to be coming in the end times, and the status of the world. But who are the betrothed? And again, other translations define it or label it as virgins instead of using betrothed. And there are three views that scholars hold to understand who are the betrothed. There's a traditional view, a modern view, and an adoptive view. The traditional view, which was the universal view up until the 20th century, sees the verses, verses 25 to 38. I know we only read a portion of that, but verses 25 to 38 is Paul consulting the Corinthians about this special case of giving their virgin daughters into marriage. They take on this view because they think that in the letter written to Paul, that they were seeking out advice from him, questioning, should we give our virgin daughters into marriage? Because then we're opening them up to possibly commit sin in the Corinthians' eyes by having sex, giving into their fleshly desires. The scholars in this traditional view take on this view because there's a verb in verse 38 that is labeled in and we'll see later on, but is labeled in the English translation as just to marry. But when you look at it in the Greek, it's not to marry, but is translated in the Greek to give into marriage. So it seems like there's some from parently or fatherly figures reaching out to Paul and saying, should we allow our daughters, our virgin daughters, I guess in a pure state that they're virgins, go into marriage and possibly commit sin? Is the Corinthians question, and Paul had to address this and with regards to what is right when it comes to marriage and sex, and what is also, again, the wrong views of singleness in the Corinthians. Now, this view changed a little in the 20th century because there was a new view of understanding the term of virgins. And some scholars in the 20th century started to research what was going on in the churches in the early churches. And they took those virgins and translate to refer to both men and women. And they said these men and women were committed to one another, these virgins, in a spiritual marriage, which means they lived together but had no sexual relations with one another. They had no sexual relations. So this type of living was hard to uphold because they were just living together, but they had no sexual relations. And hence they had questions. Should these couples who are living together get married or remain single? This view is upheld because this style and practice of living was prevalent in the church in the 2nd to 5th century. There was records of people living together in a spiritual type of marriage, but not living in actual marriage and having sex with each other. And this is why this view became popular in the 20th century. However, there is no indication that this is the way of living, that this type of living way of being single but living together was occurring in Corinth. There's no records of it. There's nothing in the writings that refer to this. Nor was Paul directly addressing this situation. So this view, along with the other views, traditional and adopted, have their strengths and their weaknesses. So this was the modern view. And then the third view of what the virgins or betrothed were is the adoptive view. And this is the most recent view that a lot of commentaries are starting to uphold in understanding this word. And they think that it was referring to young women who were engaged, or not just young women, but along with their fiancés, that they were stuck between getting married or not. Again, going back to the context of the Corinthian church, how they view marriage and sex. There was a struggle for those who were engaged. They're like, so should we marry or not? Should we go into marriage and possibly sin, or in their views, or should we stay single and stay pure and be spiritual, holy like that by calling off the marriage and not being engaged? Now, again, all three views have their strengths and weaknesses. Most modern scholars today will uphold views 1 or 3. The second one is not as popular in today's interpretation of these verses, but it's important to understand the background and the context of why why this question of singlehood is being addressed. Now, so he says in verse, is a concern and is not a command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Again, this is not a commandment. God doesn't say you have to get married, you have to remain single, but this is advice now that Paul is giving that is biblical, I will say. He is taking his Jesus's teachings and his understanding of marriage and singleness from the God's insight, and now expounding upon it for the Corinthians to understand how their viewpoint is wrong. Now, another thing that comes out in these verses is he refers to a present distress in verse 26. It says, I think in the view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. And we have to question now, what is the present distress that Paul is referring to? Why is there and there is no specific knowledge with regards to the the Corinthian church in First Corinthians that Paul of any type of specific distress other than the ones we mentioned before about the man having the improper relationship, people going to prostitutes, and some other things. But it's not really a distress. Those are things that the church has to correct. But there is no specific duress. Now, scholars, instead of pointing to like a specific problem of the church, they believe Paul in saying present distress is actually referring to the last days, or the days in which we are waiting for Jesus's return. And we see this in the later verses, that in verses 29 to 31, it will support this idea of present distress and the last days. There is a present distress in the community as Christians because there is hostility towards believers. Unbelievers are just continue to give oppositions to the Christians because of what the Christians value, what the Christian moral is, and how the Christians prioritize God over everything else. And the world is continuing to reject Christianity, to reject Jesus. And again, the apostles, when Jesus ascended and he said he will return, they didn't know when he was going to return. They thought he was coming back soon. So they were doing their best to live out their lives to the fullest. And so they were saying, because Jesus said he's going to return soon, we have to live ready for his second coming. And in living ready, we're going to be, and Jesus taught that there will be hardships, there will be persecution, you will be rejected by this world. So this present distress is what Paul is referring to. And his suggestion is you are to remain as you are. And it's not saying that he's saying don't get married or do get married or any of that. He's saying your focus is not marriage or your singlehood. Your focus should be on how you are living in preparing for Jesus's return. Are you living the life that you are called to by God, not by this world, but by God? And so he's gonna explain more of this in the later verses. So again, he ends this section that I just highlighted, that saying marriage is not sinful. He goes on to give viewpoints of why the single life may be better than marriage in his understanding, and the view of how he views his life in the terms of present distress in the last days of living fully for God. But he is saying marriage and singlehood is not a matter of morality, of how the First Corinthians have called it and made it out to be. So I want to just stop right there. I went really quick on this section. We're going to get into a little bit more, what's it called? Just more to unpack in the coming verses. But is there any questions up until this point regarding how Paul is introducing singleness and his thoughts on it?
Pastor Chris, is it possible that that the early churches, which were the Catholic churches, and they had where the fathers, they couldn't, or the priests couldn't get married, and the sisters couldn't get married. Is that did they take this verse and applied it to that?
So I will have to do a little bit more studying, but I do believe this is one of the verses, this chapter actually is one of the chapters that they use to say, like, it is better to not get married and rather serve the Lord. Yes, it is very, this is the verse. This is actually one of the most important passages in the New Testament with regards to marriage and singleness that you will find. Again, Jesus really never covered singleness. He did talk about marriage. He did talk about not divorcing, and he did talk about this, but he never really talked about singleness. And the church latched on to Paul because you saw, again, scholars believe he was single, whether he was married and separated or he never got married. They believed that just live the life that Paul lived is something that that some people are called to, is a gift of celibacy, and it is a gift especially for those who are priests or nuns. I think the Catholic Church took this too literally in a sense, where some of the priests do not have the gift of celibacy, some of the nuns do not have the gift of celibacy. It is something that is a special calling that God gives to someone. And we see it because of some of the actions of the sinful actions in the history of the Catholic Church that has come out in the past and even in the present. I also want to say the Catholic Church did not take into consideration that in the Old Testament, priests were married. Yes, it is part of the Old Covenant and the priesthood, but I think they took it too literally, this teaching in the New Testament, that they didn't consider that marriage is not, it should be for everyone. It actually helps people to avoid temptation of relieving their sexual desires in an illegitimate way. So yeah, definitely the Catholic Church took on to this holding very strongly. And you could see some of the aftermaths of what happened, of being twisted a little bit of what Paul is trying to say.
Right.
He's not saying you have to be single. And a lot of people take that stance. They're like, man, Paul is just a guy who loves singlehood, and he is an advocate for celibacy and that everyone should be celibate. That is not Paul's stance. He is not saying everyone should be single, and he will continue to reiterate that. And he will continue to also reiterate that singlehood is a special gift that you must have so much self-control in order to live in that way, so that you don't fall into sins again of fulfilling your sexual desires in illegitimate ways. Again, going back to last week, he says, if you have the passion, get married. Otherwise, you're going to fall into sin. So yeah, great point.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Mhm.
When you were talking about people who are like living together and spiritually connected, but not like having sex with each other, are you talking about like real marriages, like real couples?
So I will have to expound upon that research, but I don't think they were considered as like legitimate couples. Maybe they were. Maybe this practice of the First Corinthians of, again, in the early church, dualism was a really big issue. The things of the body is evil and the things of the spirit is good. So it could have been legitimate marriages and they were just abstaining sex from each other so that they can be a little bit more spiritual, a little bit more holy, that God's favor and blessing will be upon them. Now, I will have to do a little bit more research if it was actual marriages or not. My guess is it's not actual marriages. They were just living together. And then if you take on that traditional or that modern view, they're asking Paul this question: should we get married because we have these desires starting to build up for sexual desires? So my guess is they weren't legitimate marriages in that sense.
Yeah, it's just interesting. Like if they thought sex was so sinful, like how were they having children?
Yeah, so I don't think it was a prevalent practice, like it was the majority of people doing this. I think some people took it too literally of, their understanding of dualism and their desire to be more holy and spiritual. And Paul is actually teaching against this. Being separate or being married is not what makes you spiritual or holy and righteous before God. Paul will go on to say there are advantages for singleness, but that's not what holiness or what makes you right before God. So yeah, again, obviously they were having marriages, they were having sex because the church grew and people and they evangelized and it grew. But there was people with the misunderstanding that went to the extremes to practice their life and marriage or their spiritual marriage in this way.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Those are good. All right. Any more questions? If not, let me continue on. So this is the meat of this section that we want to cover today. This is, I know the words are a little bit small, but I want to fit it all in one verse. Oh, one page. So let me read this for you. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. If I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. A lot to unpack here. It's a meaty section, and that's where we're going to be going in. Paul is talking about the life of singleness, and notice I put this in quotations because this life of singleness is also something that the married people need to understand and apply to their lives. And I will explain that in the world, what's going on in the world. So he opens up this part, these verses, verse 29a and 31b, of talking about the limited time. He's not just talking, and going back, remember, he's talking about the present distress, that we are in the last days. He's not just saying, he's not making this statement that where time is limited just because each passing day we're getting closer to our deaths as we get older and stuff like that. Yes, that is true. Our time is shortening on this earth every day that we live. But he's saying this statement with the perspective of each day, that each hour, each minute, each day that passes, we're getting that much closer to Christ's return. Not to our deaths, but Christ's return is his focus. Remember, we are not of this world, but we are passing through this life into a life that is eternal with God, that starts with Jesus' second return. That's his perspective that he wants us to see. Don't think about your own death, but think about the life that is coming with Christ. So that is what he's talking about, limited time, the world passing. And he talks about responsibilities versus comforts. And you're going to be like, what do you mean he's talking about responsibility versus comforts? Where do you see that in these verses? Let me unpack it. He goes and says some controversial things if you were just to take it literally. Going back to the verse, he says in verse 29b, from now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none. Like, what do you mean? As a married man, I'm supposed to live like Esther does not exist, and I'm back to single life, the bachelor life? Is that what he's saying? And he continues on, those who mourn as though they were not mourning. How can you mourn but not mourn at the same time? And those who rejoice as though you're not rejoicing. What are you saying, Paul? And Paul is going on to say, concerning the remaining time that we have as we draw nearer to Christ's return, since it's limited, there is a certain way that we are called to live. There's a certain way, a perspective of life that we should have that looks towards the future of Christ's return, and live in a way that we are valuing eternity's value, not present day value, but eternity, internal stuff that we are to value that is to come. That's what we should be conscious of how we should be living. We should be ready to make sacrifices now for the rewards of what lies ahead in heaven, for the rewards of what lies ahead when we are living with eternity with God. If you take that perspective, combining the first couple of verses in this section, then it starts to make sense why he says men who have wives should live with no wives. Again, it's not a literal statement. He's not saying men or females as well. This goes both ways. It's not just calling out the men. Paul is not saying to live like you have no spouse or family. He is saying you are responsible for your wife. You are responsible for your family. That you cannot let go of. That is not what I'm calling you to lose. Or rather, I'm calling you to lose as you are responsible for your family. Are you willing to sacrifice, forgo some of the pleasures and comforts of your spouse and family in order to focus on serving the Lord, in order to serve and focus on serving God's work? Let me repeat that again. Are you willing to sacrifice and forgo some of the pleasures, the comforts of family, your spouse, to focus on God's work? Let that sink in a little.
I
And he
think we
goes
would all say yes, but I think
in our,
what I'm reading here is it becomes much more difficult when when you're married, and it becomes even more difficult when you have kids, which is why when I see, those missionaries doing that, it is, it's amazing to see it, but it does become more and more difficult when you have more responsibilities. If I didn't have responsibilities, I could just quit my work now, give up everything and do that. I can.
yeah. No,
Can't
and
do
again,
that.
he's not saying just give up your responsibilities, but I think what he is challenging back then and even today, as we apply it to today's world, we start to blend and blur the lines between responsibility and comforts and pleasures of what it comes to being our spouse and family. Those start to blend. And you
Yeah.
can't see the difference between I'm being responsible of being a fatherly, a husband, between that and, man, I'm just too focused on my family and not on God.
Yeah.
It's
I
a
think
hard line. It's different for everyone, I think, but Paul is calling that out. The best example I have to give to this is this example of our parents' my parents' generation, as they were so involved with church that they were sometimes sacrificing the responsibilities of family to put God first. And then when I received the reverse aspects of the next generation, sometimes we are sacrificing the responsibilities of serving God to then in exchange for the pleasures and comforts of family. There, one side is sacrificing too much family, and then another generation is sacrificing too much God. There's not a good balance between responsibility and serving God. So Paul wants to challenge this. Again, he's not calling husband and wives to abandon your families, abandon your spouse. But in a sense, even though you're married, you want to have a life of singleness not in terms of your relationship status, but a little bit of life of singleness in what it means to be undivided attention and devotion to God, which is sometimes lost when you get married, sometimes get so lost in trying to raise your family, take care of your family. And again, those lines between responsibility and pleasures and comforts of family start to blur.
Yep. True. Thank you.
So Yeah, he goes on to say, if you're mourning, not mourn. You're like, how can you not be mourning? And again, it's a difference between present, what you are experiencing in the present, or if you have a view of the future. He's not saying you can't mourn, you can't have sorrow, you can't grieve in the present life. But he's saying do that, but it's temporal. Don't let that weigh you down. Don't let mourning, grief, sorrow weigh you down just because you're experiencing in the present. Remember, what you are experiencing in the present is comparatively short to what remains, what is coming up in the head of the eternity with Christ that you are supposed to be living for. If you put it in that perspective, yes, have your appropriate time to mourn, to grieve, or to go through hard times, but don't get stuck in it. Don't get lost in it. Because your life is more called to than just that present time. Again, even with the rejoicing, there'll be times of great joy and happiness in our life. Sometimes we get lost in it. Man, my life is going so great. And we just get lost in the joy and happiness of how everything is going so smoothly, everything is going right for us, that we are not, we're too much involved in this type of rejoicing in the present. He said, Paul saying, not to rejoice too much, but think about the rejoicing that is coming in the future. And if you think about that, there's still so much to do. There's still so much to do if we're preparing for what's coming in the future. That the harvest is ready. And it's another verse I want to take from. Yes, rejoice in what you need to rejoice in today, but get back to work. There's lots to do in preparing for Jesus' second coming. He says another statement, buy stuff. Let me make sure to read the verse right. And those who buy as they have no goods. What sense does that make? If you buy something, that's you have something, but he says you have no goods. Paul is referring, remember that everything we buy, everything that we own, everything that we think belongs to us, instead of seeing it in the present context, think of it in the future context. Everything that we own actually belongs to God. And since everything belongs to God, and if we think about the future context of our lives with God, then we are to use what God has given to us in the present to serve him. We are to be stewards of what God has given to us, blessed us with, so that everything we have can be used to glorify him and make his name known. And that will be preparing for Jesus' second coming. And lastly, he says, let me get the verse again. And those who deal with the world as though they have no dealings with it. Again, yes, we are presently living in this world. We are in this world, but Paul is reminding us we are not of this world. We get so sucked into the way of our present situations, or even our 5-year plan, our 10-year plan, our 20-year plan. And that is what I'm going to label as the present circumstances and situations that we live in. And again, this goes back to being single or marriage. We are so sucked into this perspective that we are actually then sucked into living in this world, not being of this world. Paul's reminding us we are not citizens of this world, this sinful world that we live in. But we are citizens, we are children of God that are to live for the kingdom of God. And that we are, again, passing through this world. So instead of being so sucked into the ways of this world, we have to separate ourselves from this style of living, this perspective of living, this attitude of living in the world, and change it to we are of this world, preparing for our heavenly home with God. Again, he starts with singleness, and now he's broadening the perspective to not just include just singles, but he's broadening it to everyone, whether you're married, single, have a family or not, have kids or not. Are you willing to forego some of the comforts, some of the pleasures of this world to be focused on something that's even greater, that you won't be rewarded now for, but you will be rewarded in the future for, with such greater rewards than what you think of present joys, things that you can rejoice. Again, I have to note this, I have to make this clear. Paul is not saying sacrifice your families, your spouses. He's not saying you can't mourn in the low moments. He's not saying you can't rejoice in the high moments. He's not saying you can't have emotions in all this. He's saying you can't enjoy life. He's not saying any of those, but be reasonable. If we put it in the perspective of our eternal life with God, yes, there's appropriate times for this, but don't get caught up in just those things. You are called to much more with your life. So Paul wants us to be responsible in all aspects of our lives, taking care of our family, spouses, mourning, rejoicing, buying things, but do so in a way that you aren't making the sacrifice God in how you serve God, but you are sacrificing some of what the world labels as pleasures and comforts of the way you live. So he's going to expand. He's going to explain a little bit more about this life of singleness, and he calls these things anxieties. And I'm laughing because he just on how he explains it. He says a married man has anxieties. A married woman has anxieties because of their spouse. They have worldly troubles because of their spouse. Paul's desire is all followers of Christ to be free of anxieties and concerns regarding the present life. Again, everything that came before. He wants us to be free of that in order that our devotion, our obedience, our service to God will be constant. He's comparing the life of a single person to a married person. And again, his stance is he is supporting his stance that singleness is better, whether you're a single person that never married or a widow. But he's comparing the single person and the married to drive in his point that there are anxieties and concerns that pop up into our life that divide our attention away from serving God. He's using marriage as an example. That is not the only example, but he is using marriage as an example. Because a married person has responsibilities to take care of his spouse, take care of his family, their attention is divided, but he is also stating you cannot put your spouse or your family in a higher priority than God. So again, he uses an example between singles and married people. I want to broaden that perspective, broaden this application. And it's not included in these verses, but in today's present day, I want to broaden that perspective. Some people say they're married to their work. Again, being married to your work, your attention of serving God and devoting your life to God starts to get divided. Some people said they're married to their success, to riches, to comfort. We get caught up in the way that we're living in the present, which starts to impact how we are devoting our lives to serving God, how we are a little bit derailing from the way that God has called us to live. He has commissioned us to go and make disciples. He has commissioned us to go and teach, to go and baptize, to go and make the name of Jesus known. But when we get bogged down with other things in life, our devotion to God gets divided and we start to lose focus. Now, I know Paul is saying the life of singleness is you have this undivided attention to God, but I do also have to point out, this is also true for singles, that they get divided their attention to God. Even for singles, technically you have more time to devote to God, but we see in today's society, and it's probably true in the Corinthian society as well, even as a single, we start to devote our time and the way we live about and make it about ourselves rather than about God. And I see it even as a single, it's that YOLO you only live once mentality. I got to experience all this world has to do. I got to travel. I got to eat all these things. I got to have fun with my friends. We start to lose focus, and we're, even as singles, don't have that undivided attention to devote ourselves to God. So then Paul makes this statement. Again, he is not putting pressure to call people into celibacy, but rather he's giving them an understanding of the realities of singleness and the realities of married life. And he's saying people understand that singleness is not one of restraining your life of being fulfilled, to live a life fulfilled. Singleness is not that. Rather in the eternal perspective, you can actually live a life that is fuller and more fulfilled because you're devoting yourselves more to serving God, and you're not distracted, and your attention is not divided. Again, Paul is helping not just singles, but all Christians understand, whether single or married, the perspective of life that we must live with right now is not about the present, immediate, my needs, my focuses, my desires. But instead, he changes that perspective. We as Christians are living in difficult times. We are being, where Christ his name is continuing to be pressured by the world, to be slandered, to walk away from that life. We are living in a time where we should be waiting for the return, the second coming of Jesus. And we're living in a time where God has called us to and given us the opportunity to serve him as we wait for Christ. He's giving us that perspective. But Paul's point is, there are advantages for being single because you have more time to devote to God. But he's not giving an excuse to married people saying, oh, you're good, go take up your family only. He's also saying, married people, do what you got to do, but also see there are things you have to sacrifice when it comes to pleasures and the ways of this world that you have to give up in order to continue living a life that is devoted to God. Any questions or comments on this section? Again, this is a hard section in many different ways. It's hard because it challenges the norm of how we are to live. It challenges the way that even the modern church thinks of, because we're so focused on the present activities of the present, what's going on in the present, that it does divide our attention to how we should be living with a perspective of what lies ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to say a comment that when it was explained to me that Jesus didn't heal everybody, he could have, because he was God, and he didn't save the Jews from the persecution and enslavement and so on, the injustices that were going on in the day. He only did it when he could point to a spiritual awakening and the desire for eternal life, when he could illustrate, I'll give you living water that you'll never thirst, and for eternity. And that helps me to understand where our focus should be. I know there's so many horrible things going on in the world today, and people suffering and with all kinds of mental illness and the pressures of the world and all these things. But we need to keep our eyes focused and our desires and our heart focused on following Jesus and eternal life.
Yeah, definitely.
And that he will come back. That's what I'm counting on. He will come back, and that he's giving us Gentiles a chance to believe in him and the spiritual awakening. And then he will return and rule for 1,000 years.
Yeah, he's not just giving Gentiles a chance, he's also giving the Jews a chance too.
Yeah.
They once rejected him. And that's right. The perspective that we should live each and every day is not just to fulfill what we have to do in the present, in that day, in that week, in that year, But we who are followers of Christ are called to do so much more as an act of service, as an act of worship to our God. And I think that's what Paul is highlighting. And he is an advocate for celibacy, but he's not saying everyone's called to this life. But even so, everyone has a responsibility and a devotion they are to do of how they are to live in following after Christ and living for God's kingdom. Let me just, we have one more passage. We're going to be ending chapter 7. So this is the conclusion that Paul, this is going to be the conclusion of Paul's teaching when it comes to marriage and singleness. Again, this is a very important chapter in the Bible because, again, there's not much talk of singleness. There are portions of marriage, but Paul gives a great explanation of marriage and singleness in this chapter. I'm not saying there aren't other chapters, but this is a very profound chapter on marriage and singleness. And he's going to conclude this section, verse 36. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly towards betrothed, if his passions are strong, it has to be, let him do as he wishes, let them marry. It is no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart, to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he leaves, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. So Paul is wrapping up his section. He's concluding this section on marriage and singleness. And this is what Paul is saying: follow one's hearts and convictions. Again, he is not saying marriage is the better path or singlehood is the better path. He's saying both isn't marriage and singleness is not a moral issue. But he is saying that marriage is and singleness is an amoral issue. One is good and one is even better in his eyes. Both are good. If you have the right perspective of why you're doing what you're doing, if you have the right desires of why you're going into marriage and why you're going into singleness. So he says, for those who have a desire to marry, if you have a desire for your sexual desires to be fulfilled, in a sense, he says, get married, do it in the proper way. Get married, do it with the one you love, and the one that God has orchestrated as a man and a woman coming together to reunite in the covenant of marriage before God. Do it in that sense. There's no guilt in marrying. There's no guilt in having this desire, your sexual desires to be fulfilled, but do it in the proper way that God has created it and designed it. So no guilt to the married. Stay strong as a single. He's saying for those who hear what I have to say about singleness. So even if you are engaged at the time, but you have a heart, you have a desire, and you know that you can have self-control, but you have a desire to serve God to the fullest of all that you can do, and you have peace in your heart, Paul's saying, be single. Don't fall to the pressures of what the world tells us that you have to get married. Your life is fulfilled if you have, great sex. That is not the end of. That's not what fulfills your life. But he's saying, live as a single because you know that your fulfillment is in the Lord. If you can have that peace, if you can have that self-control, do it. Because you won't be tied down by some of these other responsibilities. And again, I already covered it. It's an amoral issue, not a moral issue. There is no right from wrong, whether it's to be married or not. Yes, there are rights and wrongs when you get into marriage and singleness that you can do, but he's saying the issue of whether you get married or not is not a moral issue. And I think that's something that in today's world, we have to understand better, especially in the church, because we do pressure for marriage. When are you going to get married? When are you going to have kids? We do this pressure and we make it into almost a saying like, if you're not married, you're doing something wrong. If you see someone that is older and they're not married, they're like, man, something's wrong with that person, or they're living a wrong lifestyle. It's the perspective that we kind of creeps into our minds. Or if that couple is married and they don't have kids, man, something's wrong with their marriage. It's a wrong type of thinking. Maybe that couple doesn't want to have kids so they can devote themselves to God, devote themselves to living for God in a different way. We have to broaden our perspective on that instead of being sucked into, man, you got to get married, you got to have kids, you have to follow the progression of life, otherwise you're failing in life. That is what Paul is saying. No, if you have the right perspective, even in your current situation, single, married, kids, not married, free or slave, if you have the right perspective, be content with where you are and live devoted to God. And then he concludes this section with again, he's saying marriage is a binding relationship. It's a covenant made before God. Those who are married should not be separated. Something a single person should take into consideration before even getting married. That it's not, oh, if I don't like this person later down the road, I will separate from them and divorce from them. Paul's saying, if you are if you are thinking of marriage, be committed to it. Again, there are different accounts in our last Bible studies, when we're talking about believer, unbeliever, and separating in this. But Paul's saying in a big wrapping up the whole situation, if you're married, fight to stay married no matter what. Paul does explain his view that death is the only thing that can break the bondage of marriage. He supports the idea that the marital status will not continue in heaven. And it's also a very conservative interpretation of Jesus's teaching of divorce. And we don't have the full time to go into this. But there is what is called the exception clause, and it says, do not get divorced unless adultery is occurring in the marriage. And the most people, the way they interpret that is, Jesus is giving the grounds to divorce if there's adultery in the relationship. But there's a very, very conservative view that saying, if it's not saying that you're allowed to divorce if there's adultery. He says, if you are to separate and get remarried to someone or start a relationship with someone else, you are committing adultery if that other person is alive. And it's a very conservative stance on divorce. Again, people, I'm not saying one is right or over the other. It depends on how you interpret it. It is not set and clear in the way the Bible presents it. Even in the Greek, scholars battle about this clause over and over. Is it talking about adultery is the only case for divorce, or is it the other? But this is Paul's take, and I believe he takes a very conservative stance on divorce by saying this: death is the only thing that will allow you to remarry. But then even death says, a person who has a widow, it's your liberty, it's your choice. It's not, again, a decision of right or wrong to marry again or not marry. But again, Paul, his thinking and the way he lives is saying, it's better to stay single so you can stay devoted to God. Now, just one more statement before I wrap this up. Some take that statement in verse 39 only in the Lord to mean that a widow can only marry a Christian. If she was to remarry, she can only marry a Christian. I think it's preferred, but I think this is there's not enough support to interpret that statement as just that. That's what Paul's saying here. But again, Paul's just calling into reminding the person who is widowed and thinking of remarriage, remember of your purpose, your duties, and your responsibilities as a Christian before you consider remarrying. I think that's a better understanding than saying, if you are to remarry, you can only marry a Christian. I don't think God limits us in that way. Again, it is preferable to marry a Christian so that you two can work and do the things for God and serve God together, and your house won't be divided in that sense. Any comments, questions on this section? If there's not, let me just give us a quick reflection from today's lesson. Singleness is not a curse, but a choice. Just remember that it is not a curse. It is not a restraint either. It's not anything like that, but it's a choice that one has to reflect upon and make and have peace and self-control to live in that lifestyle. It's something that we can't look down upon as well as a church. We are in present distress and have limited time. Live responsibly. I think that's a reminder that we have to continually put, even in today's church, we are in a time of present distress. There is a lot of hate or a lot of things building up against the Christian way of living, the Christian values, the Christian morals, the way that we are devoting our lives and prioritizing God in this time. And it's going to continue to grow, that distress, because our time is limited. The day of Christ's return is coming closer and closer. Hence, Paul is calling us to say, live responsibly, not just responsibly as a father, a husband, a friend, but in your devotion to God. And then I have this, can we sacrifice pleasures and comforts to live and serve for God? Do we have eternal perspective to how we live each day? Do we approach each day with an eternal perspective? Or are we just living in the now? It's something that we have to reflect upon as individuals, as followers of Christ, and even as a church. Are we just focused on the now, or are we really living a life with an eternal perspective that, hey, we are called to go and make his name known. The harvest is ready. Go and harvest for our Lord. Go and serve the Lord. Go and love. It is something that we have to reflect upon. As I wrap up